American Politics Today, Chapter 6. Public opinion and the media. What do the people want? How should we measure opinion? Leadership does not mean putting the ear to the ground to follow public opinion, but to have the vision of what is necessary and courage to make it possible. Representative Shirley Chisholm. You have to remember one thing about the will of the people. It wasn't that long ago that we were swept away by the Macarena. Jon Stewart, comedian. One of the foundations of democracy is the belief that public opinion matters. While in office, elected officials act in accordance with their constituents' demands or else face the possibility of being defeated in the next election. Every election season, candidates, political parties, journalists, and political scientists take thousands of polls in an attempt to determine who is likely to vote, who they are planning to vote for, and what sorts of arguments, slogans, and platforms might change their minds. According to the political scientist, VOK, basing policy and election strategy on public opinion makes sense because in the large, the electorate behaves about as rationally and responsibly as we should expect, given the clarity and the alternatives presented to it and the character of the information available to it. The expectation is that citizens' evaluations of what governments is, their ideas of what they would like done differently, and their thoughts about what they like and don't like, more broadly, all have some basis in reality. The only way to assess whether government follows the wishes of the public is to have some idea of what people really want. To actually develop surveys, measure public opinion, and compare it to the policy choices made in Washington. However, a look at the results of some mass surveys might lead you to the comedian and political commentator Jon Stewart's concern that public opinion is fickle and only loosely connected to reality. Even as Republicans doubted President Obama's citizenship, a significant percentage of Democrats believed that the government had advanced knowledge of attacks on September 11, 2001. Needless to say, both claims are false. And while most Americans would agree with the late Representative Shirley Chisholm that politicians should not blindly respond to public opinion, the persistence of blatantly false beliefs about Obama's citizenship and the September 11th attack raises questions about whether public opinion is based in reality at all. Before we blame Americans for believing in conspiracy theories or take pollsters to task for mismeasuring public opinion, we need to determine how opinions are formed and how they are expressed. What does it mean when someone reveals an opinion such as support for a conspiracy theory, a desire for change in some policy, or support for a president? Answering this question requires an understanding of how opinions are formed and what goes into them. We also need to determine whether opinions are real, in the sense that they are considered judgments that shape behavior, and what problems arise when we ask people what they think about politics. Do Americans really hold the bizarre beliefs that are sometimes expressed in polling results? Can we take polls seriously if they produce results like these? Where does public opinion come from? Can politicians trust public opinion as a guide to what Americans want? And can we use opinions to measure the quality of American democracy? What is public opinion? Public opinion describes what the population thinks about politics and government, what government should be doing, evaluations of what government is doing, and judgments about elected officials and others who participate in the political process, as well as the wider set of beliefs that shape these opinions. Public opinion matters for three reasons. First, citizens' political actions, including voting, contributing to campaigns, writing letters to senators, and undertaking other kinds of activism, are driven by their opinions. Therefore, if we want to either understand an individual's behavior or analyze broader political outcomes, such as who wins an election or the fate of a legislative proposal, we need good data on public opinion. Second, examining public opinion helps explain the behavior of candidates, political parties, and other political actors. Politicians look to public opinion to determine what citizens want them to do and how happy citizens are with their behavior in office. Third, because public opinion is a key to understanding what motivates citizens and political officials, it can shed light on the reasons for specific policy outcomes. For example, changes in the policy mood. The public's demand for a new domestic policies are linked to changes in government spending. When people want government to do more, spending increases more rapidly. When people want less from government, spending goes down or increases more slowly. Different kinds of opinion. Modern theories of public opinion distinguish between two types of opinions: opinions that are performed on and opinions that are formed on the spot as needed. The first type includes broad expressions such as how a person thinks about politics, what he or she wants from government, or principles that apply across a range of issues. These kinds of beliefs typically form early in life and remain stable over time. Some of these beliefs are obviously political, such as party identification, ideology, liberal or conservative, and judgments about society's responsibility to those in need. Liberal or conservative ideology is a good example of a stable opinion. The best way to predict an American's ideology at age 40 is to assume it will match his or her ideology at age 20. The same is true for party identification. One important thing to understand about public opinion is that although ideology and party identification are largely consistent over time, these particular kinds of opinions are exceptions to the rule. The average person does not maintain a set of fully formed opinions on all political topics. Instead, most Americans' political judgments are latent opinions. They are constructed only as needed, such as when answering a survey question or deciding on Election Day how to vote. For example, when most people are asked about the oppression of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, they probably do not have a specific response in mind, simply because they have not thought much about the question. Their opinions become concrete only when they are asked about those opinions. People who follow politics closely have more informed opinions than the average American whose interest in politics is relatively low. But very few people are so well informed that they have ready opinions on a wide range of political and policy questions. Moreover, even when people do form opinions in advance, they may not remember every factor that influenced their opinions. Thus, an individual may identify as a liberal or a conservative, or as a supporter of a particular party, but may be unable to explain the reasons behind these ideological learnings. Opinions also vary in intensity. For example, one individual might strongly favor policies that allow handgun ownership and open carry in public, while another might oppose both policies but with less intensity. Intensity matters because it shapes whether and how people act on their opinions. The strong pro-gun individual would be more likely to consider a candidate's gun rights policy when deciding how to vote, while the individual who opposes gun ownership but less intensely would likely base his or her vote on other issues. Variation in intensity is one reason why government policy sometimes reflects minority opinions. In the case of gun rights, members of Congress are well aware of polls showing that a majority of people support restrictions on gun ownership. However, polls also show that most supporters of restriction do not feel strongly about this issue, while people who oppose restrictions are more likely to be intense in their opposition. Thus, when responding to public opinion about gun control, members of Congress reflect the intense minority opinion, not the weaker opinions held by the majority. Where do opinions come from? There are numerous public opinion. Some arise from early life experiences, such as exposure to the beliefs of parents, relatives, or teachers. Others result from later life events or from informal conversations with friends. Politicians and other political actors also play a critical role in the opinion formation process. Socialization, families, communities, and networks. Theories of political socialization show that children develop a liberal or conservative ideology, a level of trust in others, their own class, racial, and ethnic identity, and other political opinions based on what they learn from their parents. Opinions formed through socialization are not necessarily permanent. In fact, people often respond to events by modifying their opinions, even those developed early in life. Beyond the influence of parents and family, research finds broader aspects of socialization that shape political opinions. Consider the following examples. People are socialized by their communities, by the people they interact with while growing up, such as neighbors, teachers, clergies, and others. Support for democracy as a system of government and for American political institutions is higher for individuals who take a civics class in high school. Growing up in a homogeneous community where many people share the same cultural, ethnic, or political beliefs increases adults' sense of civic duty. Their belief that voting or other forms of political participation are important social obligations. Volunteering in community organizations as a child shapes political beliefs and participation in later life. Engaging in political activity as a teenager, such as volunteering in a presidential campaign, generates higher levels of political interest as an adult. It also strengthens the beliefs that people should care about politics and participate in political activities. Individuals' opinions are also shaped by their network, the people they interact with on a regular basis. For many people, these interactions are an important source of information about political events, as well as how these events should be interpreted. Put another way, you might not think that meeting for coffee with a friend would affect your opinions about climate change, but suppose you met on an unusually warm day And your friends mentioned how much hotter this year had been compared to last year. While such conversations are unlikely to have a permanent impact, they might well influence your thinking in the short run. For example, if a week after having coffee, you have to decide how to vote in an election where climate change is an issue. Events. So, although socialization often influences individuals' fairly stable core beliefs, this does not mean that these beliefs or opinions are fixed. All kinds of events, from everyday interactions to traumatic life changing disasters, can capture people's attention and cause them to revise their understanding of politics and the role of government. Some events that shape beliefs are specific individual experiences. For example, individual support for same sex marriage is strongly influenced by the number of people they know who are gay or lesbian. Major national or world events may also shape beliefs. For example, support for restrictions on gun ownership, such as background checks, bans on certain weapons, or confiscation of weapons from individuals with mental health issues, typically increases after a mass shooting event, although it generally returns to prior levels after a few weeks or months. And political scientist Bethany Albertson and Shauna Kushner Gadarian show that feeling of anxiety generated by events such as the COVID-19 pandemic can also influence opinion formation by de-emphasizing considerations like partisanship and emphasizing others such as the opinions of political elites. Group identity. In the United States, opinions on many issues are correlated with the state or region where a person grew up or lives. People who live in the same region might have common beliefs because they are experienced the same historical events at similar points in their lives or learn political viewpoints from one another. Political scientist Catherine Kramer has shown that rural resentment in contemporary American politics stems from the belief that elected officials at the state and national levels do not share the values held by rural residents and thus shortchange rural communities in the policy process. Individuals may rely on who look like them as a source of opinions. Some political scientists, for example, argue that group identities shape partisanship when people decide between being a Republican or a Democrat. They think about which demographic groups are associated with each party and pick the party that has more members from the groups they feel they identify with. It is important to examine group variations in public opinion because candidates and political consultants often formulate their campaign strategies in terms of groups. For example, analysis of the 3 previous presidential elections show that the electoral strategies of Democratic candidates are shaped by the goal of attracting support from young Americans, African Americans, Latinos, and women. In contrast, Republican presidential candidates targeted regular churchgoers as well as older voters and public people living in rural areas. Table 6.1 includes data on the variation in opinions across different groups of Americans. These are sharp differences among groups on some questions. For example, people of different education levels respond very differently to both questions about abortion and free speech. However, education has little to do with opinions and affirmative actions. I will zoom in for you Sorry to turn the phone in case you want to pause and read this. Politicians and other political actors. Opinions and changes in opinion are also subject to influence by politicians and other political actors, such as political parties and party leaders, interest groups, and leaders of religious, civic, and other large organizations. In part, this link exists because Americans look to these individuals for information because of their presumed expertise. For example, if you do not know what to think about gun control, you might seek out someone who appears to know more about the issues than you do. Insofar as the person's opinions seem reasonable, you might adopt them as your own. Of course, most people take account for an expert's opinions only when they generally agree with the expert, perhaps because they hold matching conservative or liberal views, or because they have some other basis for thinking their preferences match the experts. For example, Donald Trump's claims about a deep state of individuals in the federal bureaucracy who were thinking to thwart his policy agenda probably reinforced his supporters' high levels of distrust of government. Politicians and other political actors also actively work to shape public opinion. Some political scientists argue that politicians describe proposals through arguments and images designed to tap public's strong opinions, with the goal of winning support for these proposals. That said, precisely because politicians are working to build support for their preferred policies, it is relatively difficult for them to influence what people think. For example, although President Trump and his allies in Congress expended much time and effort in summer of 2020 to convince Americans that lockdowns, masks, and social distancing were not needed to combat COVID-19, only Trump's strongest supporters accepted this view. If anything, perhaps because of the dire news about the caseloads and deaths in much of the country, public opinion moved against Trump and increased support for his Democratic opinion in the election, Joe Biden. Considerations of the process of forming opinions. When people form opinions on the spot, they are based on considerations, pieces of relevant information from sources like the ones we've just discussed, such as ideology, party identification, the influence of family and community members, personal and national events, group identification, or opinions and actions of politicians that come to mind when the opinion is requested. The process of forming an opinion usually is not through a systematic, rather, people use only considerations that come to mind immediately. Highly informed people who follow politics use this process, as do those with low levels of political interest and knowledge. In some cases, opinions are formed from very little information. For example, suppose you were asked right before the 2020 presidential election whether you approved of President Trump's performance in office. There are many considerations you might have used from your evaluations of Trump's response to COVID-19 or the Black Lives Matter protest. News coverage of Trump's tariffs war with China, or a profile of one of his staffers, how Trump's tax reform affected your personal well-being, or that of your parents, or even what Trump had tweeted that day. Your opinions might have reflected things that have no connection to Trump, such as whether you just received a pay raise, whether you recently watched a video of politicians arguing with each other, or even whether you were just having a bad day. However, if you are like many Americans, your opinion would have centered on Trump's party affiliation. If you are a Republican, you approved, and if you are a Democrat, you disapproved. In fact, in modern American politics, party affiliation is used to form a wide range of political judgments. For example, when Barack Obama, a Democrat, was president, Republicans were much more likely than Democrats to say that economic conditions were poor. This pattern reversed when Donald Trump, a Republican, took office in 2017. There is also evidence that people use a partisanship to form broader judgments about people from the other party. If, for example, you are a Republican, you may dislike Democrats simply because they are Democrats, not because of the policy positions you believe they hold. Basing decisions about presidential approval on party affiliation may seem simplistic, but in an era when the parties disagree on most things, a Republican voter is likely to agree with most decisions made by a Republican president and disagree with most decisions made by a Democrat. In that sense, considerations are a useful shortcut for people who need to make judgments about a president, but don't want to spend too much time gathering or evaluating information on other situations. Considerations may lead to inaccurate judgments. This can happen, for example, when individuals decide what they think about the state of the economy based on the party affiliation of the president. But even here, if the goal is to vote for the candidate who is most likely to share your interests, using partisanship to evaluate the economy and then voting based on this evaluation is an easy way to increase the chances that you vote for the right candidate. That said, as we discussed earlier, partisanship is not the only consideration people use to form political opinions. A generation ago, when differences between the parties were not as strong, evaluations of presidential performance were often shaped by perceptions of economic conditions, when in turn were based on some combination of personal financial well-being and judgments about the state of the economy. The impact of a candidate's personal characteristics has varied over time as well. For example, one of the author's parents reported that in her first presidential election, 1952, she could not vote for the Democrat, Adlai Stevenson, because Stevenson was divorced in the modern era when the divorce rate is around 50% and many politicians are on their second or third marriage. Absent unusual circumstances, divorce is unlikely to be a factor many voters think about when forming opinions about candidates. Even in the debate over Trump's performance in office, in which partisanship played an important role, some citizens may have focused on economic conditions, Trump's golf game, or even his preference for a well-done steak. So if we look at individuals, opinions can be hard to predict or understand because we don't know which considerations will come to mind when we ask them what they think. Individual considerations in mass public opinion. While public opinion may be difficult to predict on a person-to-person basis, at the aggregate level where opinions are averaged across the population of a community, state, or nation, opinions are easier to predict. As an example of how considerations work on an aggregate level, consider figure 6.1. One important difference is that approval for Bush moved up and down during his first term, while there was no identifiable trend for Obama, and Trump's popularity remained relatively stable until COVID-19 pandemic reached America in spring of 2020, causing his approval to decline. In part, this difference reflects the increasing importance of partisanship in modern American politics. The two sharp upsticks in Bush's popularity occurred in November 2001 after the September 11th attacks and after the initial success in the Iraq War in March of 2003. Similarly, Trump's popularity until the pandemic showed no increase in reaction to favorable economic conditions or declines after his impeachment in late 2019. The best explanation is that in the current era, approval ratings are driven by partisanship. For the most part, Americans base their evaluations on whether they share the president's party identification with other factors such as evaluations of the man's character or the details of his foreign and domestic policy. Playing a much smaller role, there is no guarantee that the predominance of party identification in presidential approval will continue into the future. But until it changes, presidential approval will only modestly reflect other factors such as economic conditions, international crisis, or even the president's background or personal characteristics. How considerations interact. Opinions are often influenced by considerations that compete with or contradict each other. In the case of abortion laws, many people believe in protecting human life, but also in allowing women to make their own medical decisions. When a survey asks people to hold both beliefs for their opinion about abortion laws, their response will depend on which consideration comes to mind and seems most relevant when they are answering the question. When considerations compete, opinions can change rapidly for seemingly unrelated reasons. Consider figure 6.2, which charts Republican and Democratic respondents' evaluations of whether the United States made the right decision to use force in Iraq. As you see, Republicans were always more likely to say that military action was the right choice, although the percentage declined for both parties as casualties mounted during 2003 to 2008. However, in 2009, a new trend emerged. Democrats became increasingly more likely to say that military force was the right choice, a shift that probably had more to do with Republican George Bush being replaced by Democratic Barack Obama. In sum, public opinion at the individual level is largely formed when needed and is driven by a variety of considerations. In the case of gun control, for example, beliefs are likely to depend on individual backgrounds, whether they own a gun, hunt, or know someone who does. Their political beliefs, including their tolerance for government regulation of individual behavior, and even their partisanship and horrific events involving guns. Thus, although public opinion may shift somewhat in response to events such as a mass shooting or domestic terror attack, such events are only one factor that shapes opinion. As a result, even if an event is momentous, the shift in opinion may be quite small and transitory. Measuring public opinion. For the most part, information about public opinion comes from the mass surveys, in-person or phone interviews with a relatively small number of individuals. A mass survey seeks to measure the attitudes of a large population or group of people, such as the residents of specific congressional district, evangelicals, senior citizens, or even the nation's entire adult population. See how it works, measuring what a nation of 330 million thinks. Checklist. I will quote on here. So if you wish to pause. For large groups such as these, it would be impossible to survey everyone. So surveys typically involve samples of between a few hundred and several thousand individuals. Mass surveys. One of the principal attractions of mass surveys is that they can, in theory, provide very accurate estimates of public opinion for a large population by using relatively small samples. See Nuts and Bolts 6.1. For example, while polls taken very early in a presidential campaign, such as a year in advance of the general election, are poor predictors of the ultimate outcome. Polls taken after the campaign has gotten started, when both parties' nominees are known, provide very good predictions of who will win the election and how many votes that candidate will receive. Large-scale surveys such as the American National Election Study, ANES, conducted every election year, typically both before and after the general election. Here's Nuts and Bolts. If you need to pause that so you can read that. Use various types of questions to measure opinions. In presidential election years, participants in the ANES are first asked whether they voted for president. If they say yes, they are asked which candidate they voted for. A major party candidate, for example, Joe Biden or Donald Trump in 2020, an independent candidate, or some other candidate. Another kind of survey question uses an issue scale. For example, respondents might be asked about the government's role in protecting morality or their own liberal or conservative ideology. 2 opposing statements are given for each topic, and respondents are asked to pick the statement or one of the choices between the 2 extremes that comes closest to their views. A typical survey, like the General Social Survey or the ANES, will ask several hundred questions related to issues and candidates, along with the additional questions about the respondent's age, education, and marital status. Some surveys conducted by media sources, candidates, or political parties are shorter, focusing on voter evaluations of specific candidates and the reasons for these evaluations. In the main, the length of a survey reflects the fact that people have limited attention spans, so there is a trade-off between learning more about each respondent's opinions and getting him or her to agree to be surveyed in the first place. Problems in measuring public opinion. Polling is an important, imperfect science. Many pollsters failed to predict Trump's victory in the 2016. In 2020, most predicted support for Trump states such as Florida and overestimated support for Democratic congressional candidates. Excuse me. While the COVID-19 pandemic increased the difficulty of collecting and interpreting survey data. The fact is that measuring public opinion is hard to do. The problems begin with gatherings and appropriate representative sample of subjects. These difficulties are compounded by issues pertaining to the wording of the questions and further complicated by the very nature of the public opinion itself. Consequently, survey results must be read carefully, taking into account who is being surveyed, when they are being surveyed, what opinions are being asked about, and what mechanism is used to ask survey questions. Issues with survey methods. Building a random sample of respondents is not easy. One strategy is to choose households at random from census data and send interviews out for face-to-face meetings. Another is to contact people by telephone using random digit dialing, which allows surveyors to find people who have unlisted phone numbers or who use only a cell phone. While each technique in theory produces a random sample, in practice they both may deviate from this ideal. Face-to-face interviews of people in their homes during work hours won't include adults who work during the day and are not home and is very expensive. Even with phone surveys, many people refuse to participate. Pollsters must adjust their survey results to account for these and other potential biases. Sometimes the adjustments successfully predict results, and sometimes they don't. To keep costs down, many organizations use internet polling, in which volunteer respondents log onto a website to participate in a survey, or robopolls, in which an automated system phone people and interviews them. While these techniques are less expensive, there are often doubts about the quality of samples they produce. The wording of the questions can also influence survey questions. Table 6.2 shows the different questions asked to measure opinions about President Trump's executive order banning travel to the United States from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. As you can see, support depends on how the question is asked, whether Trump's name is mentioned, the specific countries, and the rationale for the ban. These issues shouldn't make you suspicious that pollsters are trying to skew their findings. Rather, they show just how hard it is to accurately measure opinions. See Take a Stand for more on public opinion on immigration. Unreliable responses. People are sometimes reluctant to reveal their opinions rather than speaking truthfully. They often give socially acceptable answers or the ones that they think the interviews want to hear. In the case of the voter turnout in the elections, in most surveys, up to 1/3 of respondents who say they voted when surveyed actually did not vote at all. Political scientists refer to this behavior as social desirability bias, meaning that people are less willing to admit actions or express opinions that they believe their neighbors or society at large will disapprove of, such as racial prejudice. Pollsters use various techniques to address this problem, such as framing a question in terms of the entire country rather than the respondent's own beliefs. I'm going to go ahead and give you 6.2 in case you wish to respond or pause the video to read this. The accuracy of public opinion. I'm also going to go ahead and get this one before I start again. I am so sorry. Something happened to the water. Okay. The accuracy of public opinion. Because poll results play such an important role in media coverage and public discussions about politics, questions are often raised ambiguous. Important role in media coverage and public discussions about questions are often raised about the assumptions and corrections that pollsters use to account for the inevitable ambiguities related to poll results. During the 2020 presidential election, many Republican politicians and observers argued that polls showing a significant lead for Democrat Joe Biden over Republican Donald Trump were the product of inaccurate polling questions and assumptions about turnout. Some even argued that pollsters were deliberately skewing their findings so as to bolster support for Biden. Of course, Biden won the election, although it appears that pollsters did misestimate turnout of some groups. However, this outcome does not imply that pollsters altered their surveys to hurt Trump's chances. The same models that yielded polling errors in 2020 have proved reliable in many other elections. That's why pollsters use them. Their mistake highlights the difficulty of accurately surveying the American people and shows why we should be reluctant to overinterpret survey results. Claims about Obamacare. Reform are a good example. A 2015 poll asked people whether healthcare spending by the federal government was higher or lower than estimates made at the time the program was enacted in 2010. 42% said spending was higher, 40% did not know, and only 5% of respondents gave the correct answer that spending was less than expected. Other surveys were highly correlated with party identification, with the Republicans much more likely to say the program cost more than expected and Democrats less likely. How can we explain these findings? We can offer 3 explanations. 1, many respondents likely had not thought about the questions beforehand when they were asked for an opinion as part of a survey. There was no time to do research or think things through. 2, respondents may also use partisan considerations. Obama supporters, Democrats, said they didn't know while Obama opponents, Republicans, said costs were higher than expected. If so, the responses to say more about partisanship and attitudes toward President Obama than about the cost of Obamacare. And because opinions are subject to influence by politicians and others, survey respondents might have evaluated Obamacare negatively because they formed their opinions after hearing certain public figures repeatedly describe the program in highly negative forms. 3, many supposed facts are contested truths, meaning that it is reasonable for individuals to hold a range of views. Such problems do not arise in all areas of public opinion. Respondents' abilities to express specific opinions, as well as the accuracy of their opinions, rises if they survey questions relate to their everyday life. Thus, the average American would be more likely to have an accurate sense of state of the economy or his or her own personal economic condition than of the situation in Syria. Everyday life gives us information about the economy. In contrast, we learn about Syria only if we take the time to gather information. This is the end of Chapter 6, Part 1.